In medical school, you're going to be exposed to a lot of information. So, what are you going to do with it? Is it going to stay isolated and disconnected, or are you going to bring it together? Well, I hope you bring everything together. We are, in fact, holistic creatures. Our cells, our organs, everything's working together, and you're coming to school to become a holistic doctor. So you should learn holistically. You should learn in a way where that you understand things that relate to one another, things that are similar, are different. You want to know those relations and how everything fits together. That's going to happen with a strategy called chunking. Here's an example of a mind map that I made for this video on chunking, and this is an example of what you can do with chunking, because with chunking you group things and then you create these hierarchies where you have a main topic and then subtopics and subtopics. And it's a good way to organize information. It's also a good way to brainstorm. This is called a mind map, but you can also do concept maps that are more bubbles and connecting terms. But however you do it, it is important to chunk, which is organizing and grouping things together. This is just one example, this mind map, of how you can express that chunking, but it doesn't have to be a mind map, and we'll talk about that. Challenges in med school. Why do you want to chunk? Well, for one, the analogy that's given to med students is that medical school is like drinking water from a fire hose. There's so much information coming at you really fast, and you do have to process it effectively and efficiently. And another issue is it's not like this is happening just for a quarter. This is for quarter after quarter, year after year. And so just because something worked okay the first quarter doesn't mean you'll be able to sustain it quarter after quarter, especially when at the end of your basic sciences and pathology, you have to take boards. And then at the end of the program, you have to take another board exam. So that information, if you're barely hanging on quarter one, it's going to get harder and harder if you aren't chunking. Another challenge is to understand, not just memorize. If all you know is facts and details, but you don't know how to use them, well, then that's going to be a problem when you are with patients. Chunking also helps you get the big picture. A lot of students get lost in the details. And I've heard students say, well, I can get the details in, but I don't know what they mean, so I can't answer the questions correctly. I just feel lost, like I'm just memorizing all these details. And so it's losing the forest through the trees. So how do you take a step back from the details and get that big picture view so that the details make more sense? And of course, recall is important. Knowing the information is one thing, recalling it is another. And the tests that you take are going to be testing your recall, not your knowledge. The test doesn't know how much is in your brain, it just knows how much left your brain onto that Scantron. Some elements of chunking theory and what it's all about. So you probably heard that we can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 items in our short-term memory. So like 5 to 9 things. And so therefore it'd be easier to remember 5 groups of 5 items than 25 separate things. And one example that we used to do as an activity is do a list of items that you would find at the grocery store and then have students memorize as many as they could. They all used chunking in some way. They all grouped. They grouped either by fruits, vegetables, grains, etc., or they grouped by breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or by what letters start with, or by meals that you can make, like recipes. There are so many ways to organize, but everyone organized. No one was just looking to memorize all of them with just brute force memorization techniques. And so what that tells me is that people know instinctively that if you want to remember something, you do want to group them together. Some of the other benefits are that items within a group are going to share things in common. So you study those things once. Infections generally come with fevers. So you don't have to study for every single infection, acute infection, that there's going to be a fever. It's an acute infection, so you're figuring fever. Now, there may be some exceptions to the rule, and so that's another thing that you end up learning, is that, okay, all these share all these items, all these diseases in this group share things in common, except for this one. This is the weird one. That's another way it's going to help you learn that. So on the one hand, you're able to simplify things by only studying a detail once, but then if there are any exceptions, those are going to stand out even more because they're the weird ones. And so that's going to make it even more memorable for your brain. While items in the same group are going to share things in common based on that group that they're in, items in different groups are going to be different in certain ways, and you can often determine what that difference is just by looking at the groups they're in. And that's what Chunky is. It's just grouping and categorizing. And another analogy I use, also food related, is that when you come, let's say you go grocery shopping, you come back, what do you do with that stuff you bought? Do you just put it randomly wherever you are? Just leave some stuff under the kitchen sink, some stuff in the closet, the milk is under the bed. You know, that would be chaos. How are you going to find anything? Where's the whatever? I don't know. It could be anywhere in the house. That's not how things work. You have a place for things. Things that need to be refrigerated go in the fridge. Things that have to be frozen go in the freezer. Dry items can go in the pantry. You probably have some sort of system of where you put things in your house, not even just food-related things. And why do you do that? Why do things have a place to begin with? Why do you organize your house? Well, for one, so that you can find it later. If you don't know where something is, it's going to be tough to find it. The same thing with your brain. One of the reasons for grouping and categorizing is because you're putting it somewhere where that you're going to be able to find it. You know that this item is in a certain group, and so you're going to start thinking about that group first, and then you'll be able to access that information a lot easier than if you're just trying to pull it out of nowhere. Another benefit of why do you organize your house is that it's easier to keep things neat and tidy and orderly. And that's another thing is that as you're organizing, there's going to be more order and things are going to make more sense. So you want to group and categorize. This is so important. If you're stuck just studying the details, it might work. But if you're not chunking, you're not going to progress until you start to get that thought process, that organized thought process. As an aside, one thing I noticed from doctors, especially as I started to move along in the program, is that by my third or fourth year, I wasn't impressed with what doctors knew anymore. At first, before I came to medical school in first and second year, the doctors was like, oh my gosh, how do you know all this? This is impossible. But then after a few years of medical school, you learn a lot of those things, and then it's not as impressive. But what I've always found impressive, and what I thought was what the good doctors, what they had over me the most was their understanding and their thought process. They always seem to have an organized, okay, so what do you do with this thing? Oh, with this, it's this type of condition, so you do that, and then that, and that. And everything just seems to make sense. It's how they think about things. It's how they approach things, not just what they know. So if you're just trying to gain knowledge, that's not going to be nearly as beneficial as gaining knowledge with understanding and seeing things, how they relate, what groups they're part of, how they're different from other things. Those relationships are so important. Here's an example of a simple concept map or mind map, whatever you want to call it, of how to organize different animals. So you can just memorize these 4 animals: halibut, rainbow trout, dog, and cat. It's only 4 things. It's easy to memorize, right? But as we add more and more animals, it's going to be harder and harder. If this was a list of 100 different types of fish and mammals, then you will be much better off organizing. Okay, these are all the dogs. These are all the cats. These are all the freshwater fish. And so it helps to put things in categories to be able to recall them easier. Because remember, we can only hold a certain amount of items in our brain at once. And so if you have 100, let's use the example from before, 25 items that you need to learn, better to group them in categories and have 5 groups of 5, because each group is within that 7 plus or minus 2. But the other thing is that when you start to look at these groups, you want to look for patterns. You want to look for similarities. You want to look for rules and then exceptions. But this is where you really want to use your brain. And so, for an example, fish, you have marine and freshwater. First of all, what does that mean? Marine is ocean, salt water, and then freshwater is more lakes and stuff. Okay, so there's a little understanding. So now we know whether they're living in salt versus in freshwater. But now we can go even further. We can look at these marine fish and look for what they have in common with one another. And what do they have? What makes them different from freshwater fish? You would expect that fish that live in a high salt concentrated water medium would be different in some way to fish that live in freshwater. And so now you start asking the question, okay, what do these freshwater fish have in common, and how is that different from the marine fish? So now you're starting to understand. You're not just memorizing halibut, rainbow trout, dog, cat, halibut, rainbow trout, dog, cat. You're not just going over that over and over again. Now you're starting to see these categories and learn things about the individual fish as well as the categories of fish themselves, where that next time you learn about a freshwater fish, you understand that category. And so now you're going to be thinking, oh, does this have the same things shared in common with the other freshwater fish I learned about? And so if you have good categories, as you learn more and more, it gets easier and easier to learn it, because that new item is either going to be similar to the rest of the items in the group, in which case you already know it so you don't have to relearn it, or it's going to be different in some ways, and that's going to make it stand out, which is going to make it easier to learn. And so making these categories, it's not just about a recall technique to be within that 7 plus or minus 2, it's also to inspire deeper knowledge, deeper understanding, and seeing the big picture of, in this case, of groups of animals. But in your case, it's going to be concepts, groups of concepts, functions, organ systems. You're going to start to group these things together, and it really helps, especially when you're working with patients, to be able to think in a organized manner. Because with patients, you don't know what's going to happen. So they can be disorganized, they can be disorderly. It's really good when your own brain is organized, regardless of what's happening with them. Some chunking benefits: well, you get to organize the information so you know where it is. You can condense it, because if you know everything in this category have something in common, you don't have to study that thing every single time. We'll talk about that next when we look at some anatomy examples. You'll learn more efficiently. Again, you're not studying the same thing over and over again. You're grouping things, and so you're taking advantage of scale. You'll be able to see themes and patterns. If you don't group things, there's no way to see a pattern. There's no way to see that all the muscles in the anterior compartment of the arm are innervated by musculocutaneous, so you don't have to study it individually each time. If you never group them, you won't be able to see that pattern that, hey, these all have the same nerve, and these are all in the same group. And lastly, deriving meaning and taking this information more from just details and factoids, and information, knowledge, understanding that you can use to solve problems, that you can use to help people. That's really what it comes down to. And if you're just memorizing, you're not going to get that meaning. I really like this quote, Dr. K. Anders Ericsson. It is not sufficient to merely store the knowledge in memory. It is also critical that relevant knowledge is well organized and can be efficiently retrieved. In fact, the principal challenge of expertise is to acquire and organize the vast body of domain knowledge such that all relevant prior knowledge can be immediately accessed to guide action in encountered situations. For example, with the superior organization of knowledge, a medical expert can rapidly notice an inconsistency in a suggested diagnosis. And that's the rub right there. When I started school, I wanted to be able to feel this information, whether if something was told to me or something, if there was information or a case that didn't make sense, that would feel wrong. I wanted it to be literally to embody it. And you're not going to get that from memorizing. It takes work to chunk and to organize, but when you do that, you don't have to do these long searches in your brain as much as you're just walking along the path from one, into a group and then into the subgroup, etc. It makes the use of knowledge much more, I would say, subconscious, seamless, and quick. So a few ways that you can chunk outlines or table of contents, mind maps, and tables. So for outlines, I mean more of a basic outline, kind of like a course objectives or the lecture objectives. Those objectives may be chunks right there. And so for some of your teachers, if they have that, then make note of that, and those may be that may be helping you make your mind map right there. You don't always have to make it on your own. Okay, so here is a mind map, concept map. I use the two terms interchangeably. On anatomy, these are the muscles of the arm. The arm is broken up into anterior and posterior compartments. Anterior is in the front, posterior is in the back. Now, is this just an educational tool, or does this have reality to it? Actually, the compartments, and this is where knowing the groups helps, because he asks these questions. What are these compartments? Well, they're actual fascial compartments. The fascia will surround the muscles in this compartment. And another thing you may notice, that for the anterior, the nerve in purple, it's the same for each one. They just drew an arrow. I like that. They didn't write it over and over again. They wrote it once and then just showed that the others also have that. So they simplified and condensed their notes, but also discovered a pattern. All of the muscles in the anterior compartment are innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. Now there are other patterns, like we have a lot of flexion actions in the anterior compartment. And if we look at the posterior compartment, we see a different nerve. And so different nerve innervating anterior and posterior. And we also see a different action as well. We end up with an extension versus flexion. So just by organizing, we can see, okay, anterior compartment, all of them have the same muscle and very similar actions. Innervated by the same nerve, similar actions. Posterior compartment, different nerve, different action, and in a sense, the opposite, at least the function on the elbow. And so again, the organizing is one step. Then you have to look into it and look for patterns. And now we can say, okay, for the innervation of the arm muscles, I just have to know whether it's anterior or posterior compartment. If it's anterior, it's musculocutaneous. If it's posterior, it's radial. And then when you go down a forearm, you realize the forearm also has two compartments, anterior and posterior. And the posterior is, again, radial. So now we know the back of the arm and forearm, all radial. No exceptions. So that's cool. There's also no exceptions for the anterior arm. When you get to the anterior forearm, it's mainly median nerve with 1.5 exceptions. So the way I would learn that is, okay, anterior arm, median nerve, unless otherwise. And then I just know the 1.5 muscles that are the exception. And so by chunking all of the muscles, which are like 8 or so, but probably maybe a couple more, of the anterior forearm, instead of studying each one individually, what nerve is it, you just think, okay, median unless otherwise, and it's the 1.5. These are the ones that are otherwise. Otherwise, except for those 1.5, median nerve. Those 1.5, it's all nerve. So by chunking, grouping, you will get more understanding, but also reduce how much you study. This is something that I made from a biochemistry lecture that this just organizes a bunch of terms and how does this relate together. So I made a mind map of the terms, just wrote all the terms out and then started grouping them by similarity. Anything, and so we have enzymes. Enzymes are a part of digestion. Actually, let me take a step back, because one reason that it's good to do these is because it'll help you get your thought process. So in this lecture, there were 5 basic things that were talked about. We talked about the pathways, which can be anabolic or catabolic, the classification of carbs, monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides, hormones involved, and then digestion and absorption. And digestion and absorption, those are the 2 parts of what happens when we eat. And digestion even goes further as chemical digestion and mechanical digestion. So when you're with the patient, if you think they have some gut issues, this is what you want to think about. Okay, we have mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, and absorption. Is it their mechanical digestion? Are they not chewing enough? Is it their chemical digestion? Do they have not enough enzymes? Or is it an absorption issue? Is there do they have a leaky gut, or do they have any sort of epithelial issue in their gut? Because not every gut issue is the same. And so if you organize your knowledge, you can be organized in how you problem solve and go one step at a time. And again, you can look for patterns like all of the enzymes and in ASE. This is from a student who said that in Natural Advantage, when I was covering the mind maps, that her head was spinning and she thought, there's no way I'm ever going to do that. That just does not work for my brain. But what happened was, it's just she just didn't experience a class where she needed it yet. And so when she got to botanical medicine with all these different herbs and all these different functions, and what helped her was connecting them together, writing those various functions and then drawing lines from the herbs to where they were going. And so just it's not going to work for every class, and you may not like it, may not like the look of it, but with certain material, it can be very useful. This is just a table. So we still have chunking though. Symptoms, lab diagnosis, allopathic treatment, naturopathic treatment. It's organized. And this is the way when you get to diseases, you do want to think about this. What are the demographics? What are the risk factors? What's the etiology? What's the pathophysiology? You want to be able to know all those things, all those categories for diseases, because then when you learn a disease, you just go through each one of those, and then you'll know everything you need to know about that disease. So knowing the chunks and studying the chunks themselves and those categories, that's what I did a lot too. Like I would study symptoms, lab diagnosis, allopathic treatment, naturopathic treatment, because I want to remember that I should have those 4 chunks. Okay, how to. When you can, group things in groups of 3 to 5 concepts or items. Of course, there's sometimes where you can't control how much goes into a group, but try to look for 3 to 5. I think that's a nice number. Remember, it's 7 plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9, but that could be too much for a med school brain, especially at the end of year 1, 2, etc. So 3 to 5 I thought was a pretty nice number, but you can't always control that. Start with the big categories, like for a lecture, what are the main 3 topics, or 4 or 5? Start there and then go into that, okay, now in this category, what are the main 3 to 5 main subtopics? And so you can progress to more details and more levels of nuance, but I found it really helpful to start broad. And of course, the 80-20 rule. Don't put in too much time and energy on minute details. Focus on big chunks and try to capture at least 80% of the material with your chunks. Not every single detail has to fit. At least that's the way I approached it. Not every detail has to fit. Nobody failed because they forgot one detail. They failed because they forgot a lot of things and they probably didn't understand it to begin with. in a lot of cases, not in all the cases. But, and so don't get hung up on those little details. 80-20. Try to get 80% of the material to fit into your chunks. Here's how I approached one lecture. This is from a physiology lecture. Actually, you're going to have this from Dr. Schmidt. And what I did was I just looked at the titles and some of the terms in the slides, and I wrote them down. I wrote down the title, the terms that jumped out at me. Then I went through and I started circling things and drawing arrows to connect them. Now, what I would do here, I don't have what happened after this, but this I can then turn into a mind map, concept map, one sheet, whatever you want to make into it. But I'm already organizing things based using color and arrows to group them. And so I took all these terms that are just separate, but I'm trying to bring them together to create a story. Because at the end of the day, all of these things are just words that we created to describe a function of what the heart's doing. In this case, it's the electrophysiology of the heart. It's how the heart is conducting action potentials, which causes it to beat. And so that's what's happening. All these terms are just being used to describe it, but this process is a unified process. And so bring these terms together. Don't keep them separate. Start to group them. You can see in green, I have cardiac pacemaker at the top, action potentials in the middle, and then the HCN funny channels at the bottom. A few things about them. The funny channels are in the pacemaker cells, why I circle cardiac pacemaker, and they create the action potentials, which is why I have arrows leading from the funny channels to the action potentials. This is just how I think. Yours probably going to look different, but the point is, don't let these terms just hang out in isolation because it's going to seem isolated. Bring it together and it's going to make more sense. Here's an example of a mind map from a biochem lecture. One thing I want to point out, so this is, I forgot how many slides this was, but I would say probably 40 or so on one mind map. Now, some things to mention. I took out a lot of detail because these mind maps, if you're trying to get the big picture view, you don't want to get too detailed because they can get really busy. And so it's like you have to make up your mind. You can either look at the fly on your nose or you can stare at the plane in the sky, but you can't do both. So you need to choose what level of focus and concentration that you're going to take. There's a time to focus on the details, but there's a time to focus on the big picture, and that needs to be done actually quite a bit. More, in my opinion, more than people realize. So I would study, basically, if I were to study this mind map, I would first study everything in black, everything with a circle or a box. And then I'm going to put this away, get out a whiteboard or piece of paper and draw it from memory. Everything in black. And then I'll look at, or everything with like a box around it or a circle. Just get the main structure. And then I'm going to look at my notes. Did I get everything right? Good. If I did, then I'm going to do it again. This time I'm going to put some more details. Some of the things in red and in green. Try to add another layer or two. And each time I want to practice, I just draw it out again. It's that simple. It just takes a moment. But and so it's really good to have that big picture because it is important to know you have RNA and DNA. You have transcription, translation, and post-transcriptional modifications. It's good to have that structure in your thought process because then when if they ask you about when does this process occur, you can think, okay, is this transcription, translation, or post-transcription? And then if you've been looking in these categories, you see what makes transcription different from translation, different from post-transcription modifications, then you'll be able to understand, it's going to help you on tests. It's going to help you understand the material, but it's also going to help you think through it and perform on tests. Because on most tests, 4 multiple choice answers, 2 are going to be wrong, 1's a distractor, 1 is correct. And even just by knowing these categories or what category you're in, you can usually cross off 2, if not all 3 of the incorrect options. But don't get too far into the details. If you have a lecture, a future lecture that's just on tRNA, then you would want to make a new mind map with tRNA in the middle and then the details coming off. So you only want like 2, 3, maybe 4 layers, but not much more. If you want to get to deeper layers, then make a new mind map that's more detailed. So you can make a mind map like this, which is pretty general, and then you can make mind maps to get into more of the details. Keep them separate. Again, you can't look at something that's on your finger in front of your eyes and at something that's in the distance in the sky at the same time. You can only focus on one. And same thing with this. But you also want to not just focus on one forever, but it has to be one at a time. Focus on the big picture, but also look at the details. They'll need different mind maps. Organizing the cranial nerves. This is another example of how when you organize things, organize it differently. Don't just organize the same way every time. There are different ways to organize the information a lot of times, and that can give you more learning. So for example, for the cranial nerves, you can organize them based on whether they transmit motor information, sensory information, or both. You can also organize it a little more with more nuance to the sensory and motor, more detail. So rather than just sensory and motor or both, SVA, SSA, GSE, GVE, these are things that you're going to learn when you take neuroanatomy. But this is another way to organize. Now, which is better? Neither is better. Do them both. Organize in different ways because you're going to have to use this information in different ways. So don't just rely on one way to organize. Keep finding new ways to group. Because every time you group in a different way, you're going to learn something new. So some resources you can use to organize the information. The textbook. I mean, it's already organized in chapters and subheadings and etc. So it's basically already there for you. There's a lot of organization. Same thing with the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint may be organized, may have objectives that you can look at. Wikipedia, we're going to look at a couple Wikipedia pages next. At the bottom, they actually have, it's like an outline where that you can see where your page relates to other content. It'll make more sense when we look at that slide. BRS book, USMLE First Aid, other review books can be really good at condensing and organizing the information so you can get a sense of what pieces go to this puzzle. You can look at other outlines, people's review materials, sometimes videos, and also the people around you, doctors, professors, classmates. Ask people, what do you make of this? What are the main topics here? This is at the bottom of Wikipedia pages. We have these links that are organized. And we can see here it's chunked out. If you look at the agents, we have receptor ligands, receptors, second messengers, and transcription factors. So those are the 4 players in cell physiology, which is what this is for, and signal transduction. If we look at different membrane receptors, membrane proteins, we have G protein coupled receptors, ligand gated ion channels, enzyme linked receptors, and other. Now the G protein coupled receptors are going to have things in common, similarities that they aren't going to share with ligand gated ion channels. I mean, they will share things in common. They're membrane proteins and the receptors, so they share that in common, but they're going to have different functions and different mechanisms of action. So it makes sense to organize them that way. So when you learn a new channel, you want to know, is this a G protein coupled receptor? Is this a ligand gated ion channel? Is this an enzyme linked receptor or some other type? And then that way, when you put it into that category, if you've already learned the category, you already know some stuff about it. And to reiterate, that's really important, that as you learn more and more, there's going to be more stuff in your brain. That could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing. If the information is unorganized, it's just going to be clutter. There's going to be mass clutter in your brain. It's going to be tougher to learn and recall stuff as you go along. But if it's organized and things have a place, it's actually going to get easier over time because everything you put into that category is going to help you learn the category better as a whole, but also you already will have a lot of knowledge about that thing. To give you an example, autoimmune diseases, they share a lot of things in common. A lot of times they come in clusters where someone doesn't just have one, they'll have a couple. Now, if I learn, there's a lot of things that they have in common. Obviously, you have the immune element and the attacking a self protein element. And so those are things that I'm going to know about. If I learn about a new autoimmune disease, I already know that those are probably true about it. I'm going to ask about it before I assume, but there's already some things that I'm thinking that, okay, it probably has this, it's probably, it may come with other autoimmune diseases, so I got to be careful about that. There is an immune attack against the self protein, so we'll work on that. So if you chunk, when you learn new things, it's easier to learn. If you're not chunking, when you learn new things, it's just more of a mess. Okay, more Wikipedia. Okay, how to apply these chunks, how to use it. Number one is with practice questions. You can use those rules and exceptions. What are all the muscles in the anterior compartment of the arm innervated by? Or what are the 1.5 exceptions for the anterior compartment of the forearm? So you can ask questions about the chunks. Those are actually good test questions. You can do active recall. Just draw your mind map, draw out the chunks, draw out the picture you made, draw it from memory. And also teaching and explaining. If you can chunk the information, it's going to be a lot easier for people to understand. And so you may notice that teachers who you find are good teachers and things make sense, that they often have a way not only of putting things in simple terms, but also of condensing things where that it doesn't seem scattered. There seems like there's a rhyme and reason to how they're presenting the material. In conclusion, about chunking. Learn information in groups, in categories, in hierarchies, not in isolation. Bring them together. Chunk in categories, then look for patterns, rules, and exceptions. And you're looking for things that are going to help you study and understand it better, and you're looking for meaning. Studying chunks is quicker and more effective than studying things in isolation, and it's also easier to recall chunked information. And taking that a step further, it's not only easy for memorizing to recall, but also for understanding, which should be your end game in this. If your goal is just to memorize and not understand, I wouldn't understand why. I am assuming that everyone wants to understand this information and be able to use it to help their patients. So that's a huge one. It's not just for memorizing, but also understanding. And piggybacking on that, expertise. And I hope that that's where you're shooting for, is expertise. Not just be okay, but to be really good. But to have expertise is derived from understanding concepts, their importance, and how they relate to one another, which is what you can do if you're chunking. If you're not chunking, it's going to be really hard to do that if you don't know how things relate. If you're not grouping things, if you're not showing how they relate to one another, it's going to be tough to understand anything deeper than just the immediate details and factoids. So that's the lecture on chunking. There's many ways to chunk. I like to mind map, but don't just do what I do. Do what works for you. Also keep in mind that your strategy is probably going to change depending on the class, but no matter what, you do want to have an organized thought process. You will want to understand why you can group them a certain way and what it means, because not only is it going to help you study more effectively, recall easier, and also understand better, but it really is necessary to get meaning out of this information. Otherwise, it's just bland, dead facts and details. But you want this to come alive, and I believe chunking is a great way to do that. So when you're studying the information, study holistically. Don't just study in isolation. Don't study single things. Study holistically. Bring it all together. Bring them into categories. See how they relate. And you will not only remember the information better, but you're going to understand it a lot better too.